slowly, he'll make his way over. He is absolutely gorgeous. When he gets a bit closer, you get more of a chance to see his markings. That is, yeah, they are very, very kind of unique and very beautiful. They are also incredible camouflage. And a lot of the animals that we look at, we just consider them to be, you know, really, really beautiful, and they've got all these amazing patterns and colours. But we have primate vision, which is a little bit different to basically any of the predators. So we have red, green and blue cone cells, and having red cone cells is highly associated with doing things like eating fruits and berries, or if you're a pollinator, looking at the colours of flowers and different things like that. However, if you're a predator of these guys, you don't really care what colour an apple is. So they only have blue and green cone cells. You might think, you know, just have them anyway for the fun, but it's just like with everything, it's all a trade-off. You've got to prioritise something. And these guys are out during low light levels, so a lot of their predators choose to prioritise vision in low light levels. So they've got really, really high densities of rod cells, they've got reflective layers and all these cool things in their eyes that help them see at night. But they've kind of traded off their colour vision in return for that. Anyone want to guess what primary predator of Pembe might be? So he lives in Africa, and he's a pretty big guy, so thinking like large African predators.
Lions?
Yeah, absolutely. So lion is one, and there's one other big cat as well.
Cheetah.
Not a cheetah.
Leopard?
A leopard, yeah, absolutely. So lions and leopards are the primary predators of these guys. And if you look through the eyes of one of those predators, one of the main things you'll notice with colours is if you're looking at a rainbow, you'll see the indigos, the violets, the blues, the greens, and then everything just stays green from that point. So what they lose is the ability to distinguish your reds, yellows and oranges, and also to distinguish those from the colour green. So it's the reason we believe a lot of antelope and deer species are an orangey kind of brown colour, because as far as we can tell through the eyes of a lion or a leopard, he is exactly the same colour as the surrounding vegetation. They can't see a colour difference with the green.
Need to move them.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially movement would help them zero in on him. So with those kind of big ears and that hearing, you'll see if anything startles him here in the paddock, his first response is like a freeze response. So it'll stand completely still. And then the idea of all those markings is they help break up the shape of a bongo, essentially. So they'll all have 10 to 15 of these lovely caramel stripes going vertically across them, which would help break up the shape of their outline amongst the trees. And if you take a little look at his face, he's actually got quite bold patterns, like he's got a couple of bright circles, a big stripe across his nose. And the idea is, if he's completely still, that your focus is drawn to them. They're quite kind of high contrast to the rest of his face, and it makes you less likely for your eyes to be drawn to his eyes and ears and nose and his kind of facial features, but would clue into there being an animal there. So yeah, super, super effective camouflage through the eyes of a predator. But to us, I mean, he kind of sticks out like a sore thumb and just looks like a pretty handsome guy, really. They all have horns as well, so these guys come from a group of antelope called Tragelaphus, which is quite a big group of African antelopes. And the Mountain Bongos are the only ones where the males and the females both have horns. A lot of them live in kind of more open areas, and the horns are a lot to do with partially self-defense, but sparring between the males in particular. Because these guys live in the forest, they lose the ability really to have sparring type horns. Because you'll notice if he does actually lift his head up, so it's kind of level with the ground, they slope backwards quite a lot. And the reason for that was, say if he was being hunted by a leopard or something, he needs to be able to just tilt his head up a little bit so he can still vaguely see where he's going, and have those horns lie almost flat along his back, so as he's running he doesn't get like tangled up in the trees. So it does mean that they face so far backwards he couldn't actually really physically interlock them with another male. Instead, they tend to use their horns for feeding, and everybody needs to eat, so they'll use them to uproot small bushes and pull down branches from trees to just eat roots and leaves and things like that. And when the males do face off to kind of decide for breeding or territory rights or anything like that, it's actually hilarious because they've come up with an alternative way to do it. And they do a bit of like a dance off, really, I guess is maybe the best way to describe it. So they actually have quite a lot of like loose skin underneath their throat, and they kind of puff this up, so they kind of blow out their necks a little bit, puff up their cheeks and like bulge their eyeballs, and then they face off of each other and they do this little dance. They walk sideways facing each other, just kind of waggling their heads from side to side like this, like big bulging eyes. And the idea is, I don't really know, it's a sign of like, I'm big, I'm strong, you know, I could in theory win in a fight. Very, very rarely ever leads to any kind of physical confrontation. One of the guys is just like, your eyes are so bulgy, I give in. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. Because they're really elusive up in the mountains, this is the kind of behaviour we've caught on camera traps and things like that. so we can't kind of fully explain all of it. A lot of it is kind of quite new information to us. But they're really, really hard to track. One of the main ways we do it is through poo as well as camera traps. Feces are amazing. You can even get like a rudimentary DNA sample from poo. So there's actually like a bongo surveillance project out in Kenya, and it's like an after-school group, and all the kids go out in groups and like collect as much bongo poo as possible. You can make it like a competition, like who can find the most poo, and then they'll try and extract DNA samples from these and sequence as many different individuals as they can. And then the camera traps are a really big one. Obviously, it's a big forested area up in the Aberdares, so you can't put them everywhere. But there are a few places where they all have to go. And for the browsers, salt tends to be a really good place to focus in on for camera traps, because everything needs salt anyway for the working of your nervous system. But particularly like grazers and browsers tend to actually need more salt than we do, because it helps to do things like lubricate their jaw when they're chewing all the time. So they'll go and find salt licks. But living in the forest, they can't use just like mineral salt licks. There are a lot of rocks around. So trees that have been struck by lightning are really, really high in sodium, so they tend to become quite well used communal salt licks. So if we put camera traps up there, then the bongos will be travelling around quite an area to use them. What was that?
Are they quite common?
Yeah, fairly common, partially just because of with the African climate you get quite a few dry storms, and also because you're at quite high altitude forests, like it's going to be quite a pinpoint for the clouds gathering as it comes over the mountains. So yeah, common enough that it seems to work quite well for them to go and be able to find these. So we can camera trap those and then try and identify individuals with their markings and things as well. So we think there are 60 to 70 essentially left out there in the wild. The good news is we're kind of working towards reintroductions at the moment. So obviously the whole purpose of most of our conservation zoos these days are to get those animals back out in the wild and to try and support those wild populations. And the veterinary protocols were approved last year for 25 of these guys to fly from captivity in the US out to Kenya. So they've entered kind of the Kenyan captive population. There's a new reserve being designated, and the aim is to release those 25 there. At the moment we are limited to trying to get them back out in game reserves, essentially, because those are fenced areas.
Are they hunted then? Is that the problem?
So the thing that went wrong for them was actually disease. It is us, of course, it's always us. But it's something that comes from domestic cattle. So it reminds me a little bit of the story of the red squirrels and the grey squirrels in the UK, where the domestic cattle carry something called rinderpest virus that doesn't massively affect them. So thousands of them carry it. It's quite prolific in the population. If the bongos catch it, it's almost always fatal to the bongos. And if it gets into a community, particularly into like a nursery herd, because the females will gather with their young, then obviously that's going to wipe out quite a section of them. So that's what we think has been responsible for wiping out up to 90% of their population. Unfortunately, being a virus, you can't really vaccinate against it either, because it's constantly mutating, so it's something that would have to be done every single year to kind of still be effective. So yeah, it's a bit of a, haven't really solved that one yet, so what we can do is work on introducing them to fenced areas where they don't have been grazing, to kind of bar that contact with cattle. In terms of like traditional issues you find with like hunting for bushmeat and trophy hunting and stuff, these guys don't really get involved in that. It's a bit of a unique one, but actually there used to be quite a lot of rumours around them. So it used to be quite popularly thought in Eastern Africa that these guys transmitted leprosy, which obviously is not true, but it did protect them from contact with humans for a really long time, because no one wanted to go anywhere near the bongos because they were worried about catching leprosy. So historically they actually haven't had a lot of problem with hunting for bushmeat and hides and horns and things.
So was it a recent thing then, the virus?
So it's been like over the last century. It's kind of more the last kind of 20 years that these guys have been on more of a conservation radar at all. But yeah, no, it's been like quite a long-running problem that have been going on. Yeah.
So that's awesome, really.